There are countless stories of white settlers captured by Native Americans and assimilated into what became known as white Indians. But what about black Indians? Black people ventured into the frontier alongside whites, both as enslaved individuals and freemen, and were similarly exposed to the native nations living out there. In the South, there are documented cases of enslaved people becoming integrated into the 5 civilized tribes. A notable example is the Black Seminoles, who began as a community of escaped slaves and, through paying tribute, became a distinct band within the Seminole Nation. One might wonder why enslaved people didn't simply run away to join the Native Americans and fight against a common oppressor. While this did happen, it was far less common than people assume. The truth is, black people during the colonial period were just as afraid of the natives as white settlers were. Enslaved individuals were often slaughtered alongside their masters during raids. However, they were also captured, as native raiders did not discriminate between whites and blacks. From the start of the French and Indian War through the end of Pontiac's War in 1763, thousands of white settlers were captured by Native Americans, and an unknown number of black captives were taken as well. Black captives were valuable. They could speak English, understood Anglo-American culture, and often possessed trade skills that were useful to their captors. This brings us to the story of a man named Pompey. Unfortunately, little is known about him, outside the context of Daniel Boone's capture by the Shawnee and the siege of Boonesboro. Some believe he was captured during a raid on a Virginia plantation during the French and Indian War. Others suggest he was a slave owned by one of the citizens of Boonesboro, though no records confirm this. It's also worth noting that Pompey was a common name for slaves at the time, as Greek and Roman names were popular among the enslaved. Whether Pompey escaped or was captured during a raid remains unclear. Regardless, Pompey was adopted into the Shawnee tribe from Chillicothe, or Chillicothe as it's called today, in the Ohio country, and eventually became the official interpreter for Chief Blackfish. In February 1778, Daniel Boone and about 30 men left Fort Boonesborough in Kentucky to make salt at Blue Lick Spring along the Licking River. Boone separated from the group to scout the area and hopefully hunt for some game. During his scouting, he unexpectedly encountered 4 Shawnee warriors lying in wait. Boone fled but was outmaneuvered, and his belongings were seized. He was taken to a nearby Shawnee camp, where he was brought before Chief Blackfish and Pompey. As Blackfish's interpreter, Pompey questioned Boone about the salt makers. Boone admitted that the men were with him, and offered to convince them to surrender, provided they would not be harmed, and would be exempt from running the gauntlet. Pompey and Blackfish made it clear that they intended to attack Boonesboro. Boone, realizing that both his life and those of the salt makers were in immediate danger, needed to act quickly. The situation was dire. Boonesboro's defenses were incomplete, and most of its able-bodied defenders were among the salt-making party. Boone had to use a little bit of speechcraft to buy time to delay the attack. When Boone returned to Blue Licks with his Shawnee captors, a few of the salt makers instinctively reached for their weapons, but Boone urged him to stand down to avoid being massacred. Some of the men initially felt betrayed, suspecting that Boone had sold them out, but it soon became clear that his actions had meant to save their lives. 4 men had already returned to Boonesboro, leaving 27 prisoners in Shawnee custody. At the encampment, a council was convened to determine the prisoners' fate. Half the Shawnee warriors believed that blood needed to be shed in retaliation for the murder of Chief Cornstalk, who had been killed 3 months earlier. Prominent Shawnee figures in the camp took turns presenting their arguments, while Pompey sat next to Boone, quietly translating each speech so only Boone could hear. The council went on for hours, until it was Boone's turn to plead his case. Boone argued passionately at the council that the prisoners would make excellent warriors, and killing them would anger the Great Spirit. He also urged delaying the planned attack on Boonesboro until spring, when warmer weather would increase the chances of women and children surviving the journey to the Shawnee towns. Once there, he said, they could all live together as one tribe. Pompey translated Boone's words for the Shawnee council. As the votes were cast, the prisoners sat in anxious silence, awaiting their fate. By a narrow margin of just 2 votes, it was decided that the prisoners would be spared and taken across the Ohio River into Shawnee territory. It remains unknown how Pompey voted. As the group traveled toward Chillicothe, the Shawnee warriors began clearing a path in the snow, forming 2 lines. Boone, sensing something unusual, asked Pompey what was happening. Pompey explained that the warriors were preparing for a gauntlet run. Boone reminded Pompey and Blackfish that this was not part of the deal. Blackfish replied bluntly, "This isn't for your men, this is for you." He gave Boone a choice: run the gauntlet now or wait until they reached the Shawnee towns. Boone chose to get it over with immediately. Stripped down to his breechclout, Boone was brought to the start of the gauntlet. As he ran, he zigzagged through the lines, making it difficult for the warriors to strike him. Near the end, he barreled through one warrior who blocked his path, knocking him to the ground. Impressed by Boone's agility and resilience, the Shawnee praised him as a great chief of the Long Knives. Upon reaching the Shawnee towns, the captives endured adoption rituals. These involved intense scrubbing and removal of most hair, leaving only a top knot. 17 of the salt makers were adopted into the Shawnee families, while 10, deemed less desirable or poorly behaved, were sent to Detroit to be sold to the British. Boone, however, was adopted by Chief Blackfish and given the name Shell-Wo-Tee, meaning Big Turtle. Over the next 5 months, Boone adapted to Shawnee life with surprising ease. While he never lost sight of his ultimate goal of returning to Boonesboro, he formed a connection with his foster parents, Blackfish and his wife, as well as their 2 daughters. His relationship with Pompey, however, remains a mystery. Historical accounts provide few details about their interactions. It is plausible that they spent significant time together, as Boone became bilingual during his captivity, likely with Pompey's help. It is also possible that Pompey had a Shawnee family of his own, though details about his adoption or integration into Shawnee society remain unclear. Boone bided his time playing the role of Shawnee until spring, when he escaped and traveled 160 miles in just 4 days to warn the settlers at Boonesboro of the impending attack. In September 1778, a force of 450 native warriors, mostly Shawnee, along with a small contingent of militia from Detroit, marched on the fort. Pompey, riding a pony and carrying a white flag, approached Boonesboro and called for Boone. He conveyed that his father, Chief Blackfish, wished to speak with him. Boone emerged from the fort, and the 2 men exchanged words, though the content of their conversation has been lost to history. Boone accompanied Pompey back to the Shawnee camp. Before formal negotiations began, Boone and Blackfish had a personal conversation. Blackfish expressed heartbreak over Boone's departure, saying that had Boone simply asked, he would have allowed him to visit his white family. Boone explained that he had missed his wife and children and felt compelled to return to them. The negotiations began, with Blackfish presenting terms for surrender of Boonesboro, including allegiance to King George III, as outlined in a letter from Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton of Detroit. Boone relayed these terms to the officers at the fort, who unanimously rejected them. Boone, hoping for reinforcements from Virginia, managed to prolong the negotiations. Meanwhile, the settlers at Boonesboro prepared for siege. Women, including Boone's daughter Jemima, donned hats and carried rifles to create the illusion of a larger garrison. During the negotiations, Pompey rode up to the fort and offered to trade his pony for a rifle. The settlers, accustomed to rigid colonial social structures, were offended by his audacity and rejected the offer, warning him that if he approached the fort again, he would be shot. Pompey continued to survey the fort, trying to gauge its defenses. On the final day of negotiations, tensions boiled over. Suspecting treachery, the settlers realized the Shawnee intended to capture Boone and a few others during the council. The settlers broke free and retreated to the fort under cover fire from sharpshooters on the walls. Boone's younger brother, Squire Jr., was wounded in the shoulder but managed to reach safety. The siege that followed lasted 10 days. Both sides engaged in frontier-style trash talk known as blackguarding, exchanging clever insults to provoke one another and reveal enemy positions. Pompey, with his strong command of English, excelled at this. He taunted the settlers, questioning their courage and daring them to fight in the open. At one point, Boone's daughter Jemima was drawn into the verbal sparring. Pompey demanded that she and other women come to the gate so that the Shawnee could see their beauty. Though initially reluctant, Boone allowed the women to stand at the gate's opening. Pompey and the Shawnee warriors admired their appearance before retreating to the camp. The settlers despised Pompey, and many sharpshooters aimed to kill him. His boldness and relishing of trash talk ultimately led to his downfall. Accounts of his death vary. Some say he was shot out of a tree by Daniel Boone or another marksman. Others claim he was killed while attempting to dig a tunnel beneath the fort to plant explosives. Despite the conflicting accounts, Pompey's taunting voice was eventually silenced, and the defenders celebrated his absence. Some accounts suggest that Pompey may have survived the siege and moved west with other Shawnee families, however, there is little evidence to support this theory. After the Shawnee abandoned their siege, settlers discovered a cache of bloated corpses near the Kentucky River. One of these bodies was believed to be Pompey's. The fact that the Shawnee, who typically retrieved their dead, left them behind was interpreted by the settlers as evidence that they did not care about him. However, this narrative likely served to discourage enslaved people from considering alliances with native tribes. It seems unlikely that the Shawnee, especially Chief Blackfish, would have disrespected someone as valuable as their trusted interpreter. While it is clear how the white settlers felt about Pompey, despising him for his audacity and his role in the siege, the perspective of the enslaved people at Boonesboro remains a mystery. These individuals who were armed and fought alongside their masters must have had their own opinions about the Black Shawnee. Did they view him with curiosity, or did they see him as a renegade who had forsaken the struggle that they shared? Unfortunately, their thoughts and feelings on Pompey are perspectives we are unlikely ever to uncover. That's all for this video. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. Take care.